of school is this anyway?
I can handle things. I'm smart.
Stupid is as stupid does, sir.
But have you considered that he might just be that good?
Not this good.
Welcome to the Mr. IQ Podcast. Here's your host, Chip Franklin.
And I wanted to know the ones that you could never say on television. I mean the filthy words that are always filthy. There are a lot of these little two-way, double entendre words that have two meanings, words that are okay part of the time. I call them like part-time filth. Some of these words, they're only 50% dirty. You have words like ass. Ass is hardly even a dirty word anymore, but it has a few meanings that you can't say on television. That's what I was talking about. What can you say on television? That's another one of those places where we can't use these words all the time. But some of them are all right some of the time. Ass is all right on television. You can say on television things like, well, you've made a perfect ass of yourself tonight. But you can't say, hey, let's go get some ass.
If you're tired of arguing with strangers on the internet, try talking with one of them in real life. If you're disappointed by your elected officials, grab a clipboard, get some signatures, and run for office yourself.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
The human voice is remarkable. At least to humans it is. I grew up in a loud house with 4 older sisters who laughed hard and sang out loud, as did my mother, who actually recorded an opera record back in the 1940s. And along the way, I learned that finding your voice is both a literal and metaphorical journey, and that the path between the message and the messenger is often narrow and impossible to differentiate. As I was preparing to speak to today's guest, John Colapinto, and his new book, This is the Voice, I couldn't help but think of my journey that led me here. I'm one of those lucky few who's been able to have a career where people have paid me money to either hear me speak or sing.
I went to college, I majored in philosophy. I graduated, got a job with a philosophy company.
And for the last 25 years, I've done a talk show where I get to ask people questions, and that all led to this podcast where I get to speak to the smartest people in the world. John Colapinto is a Canadian journalist. He's an author and a novelist and staff writer at The New Yorker and Rolling Stone. And in 2000, he wrote the New York Times nonfiction bestseller, As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl. His latest is This is the Voice, which is both an informative and entertaining examination of the evolution of the human voice. So, John, welcome to the podcast. So you're a writer, but this whole story about the evolution of the human voice started off with your own voice, right?
Yes, I was writing for Rolling Stone magazine, and this was back in 1999, and I'd been working with them for several years, and it had gotten out around the office that I played guitar and sang in an amateur capacity. But when Jan Wenner, the owner and editor of Rolling Stone at the time, decided that he wanted to put together a rock band using the magazine staff, he remembered that I was supposedly a singer. I can hold a tune, I can sing loud, or at least I used to be able to. And so I agreed to do this. I was 40 years old. I wasn't really aware of how to warm up my vocal cords. I mean, I'd heard people did that. I had never done it. And so I, in rehearsals, was singing ridiculously hard and loud. Actually, Peter Wolf from the band, Jay Giles Band, actually pulled me aside during one of our rehearsals and said, you don't do that in a rehearsal. I mean, save something for the show. But it was too late. I think I'd already hurt myself. And then the night of the performance was crazy. 2,000 people, Yoko Ono, Val Kilmer, Paul Schaefer, and others in the audience, which upped my stress level. And you know, as someone that uses his voice professionally, stress will make you push your voice. And long story short, I injured my vocal cord. I really started to bleed, like a bruise in one of the vocal cords, and that created scar tissue, which creates like a lump on the edge of your vocal cord, one of your vocal cords. Yeah, it creates this rasps and rattles, and your listeners can probably hear a little of that in my voice now.
My best friend growing up, and still my good friend today, is a guy named John Carroll. He was in the Starland vocal band. And he was a prodigy. When we were 12 years old at a party, I remember, and he was playing piano, and all these girls came up, and I was like, dude, you got to teach me how to do that. But over the years, I've developed this theory, and I remember it started in 1972 when I heard Jackson Browne's debut record, and I thought, well, I can sing like that. And then I realized, and I came up with this theory, I call it the Bob Dylan theory, and the theory is that if you don't have a great voice, it's incumbent upon you to create songs of depth and real meaning because that's your avenue. And I've seen it. In fact, I challenge people to show me a person with a really beautiful songbird voice who is a really great writer. That may not be fair, but I mean, that's the way I've looked at it over the years. Did you run into anything like that writing your book?
Well, it's funny. I don't write about it in the book, but now, of course, I wish I did. I mean, the thing that jumps out to me immediately when you talk about that, and I think it's fascinating, is actually Lennon and McCartney, two guys that were incredible singers, incredible writers, but the guy that wrote the lyrics that people sort of call visionary and extra special was John. And John was the guy of the group who thought his voice wasn't so great, always felt embarrassed about it, always made George Martin put effects on it. He did strange things like lie on his back when he would sing certain songs. He wanted to be swung from the ceiling for one song. I forget which one. They didn't do it, but that was his idea. So really, maybe to compensate for a feeling that his voice wasn't as good as Paul's, with whom he was in endless competition, maybe he just wrote, like I Am the Walrus, to get over that, while Paul was writing, I don't know, Love Me Do. No, that's not fair to Paul.
It's not fair, but it is. You're right, though. There is something to that, I mean, your book fascinates me because I've used my voice my whole life. I grew up doing comedy, music, and now I do talk radio. And I'm 64, so I've been playing for about 50 years. The only time I ever lost my voice was doing comedy, never doing music. And
interesting.
And what I learned is you can have a raspy voice that kind of cuts out and can be kind of gravelly. And people don't even have to understand what you're saying in music, but in comedy, every word is incredibly important. And if you stutter it or you skip over it or your voice cracks and the message doesn't come out, nothing works. I mean, you write about everything and you travel the world studying the human voice. But for me, your book was like a mirror to my life and how I spoke and how I communicated. It was fascinating. And being a singer yourself and studying other speakers and singers, did you find something unique about a live performance as opposed to an event that was orchestrated and recorded without a crowd?
The idea that live singing is, in a sense, almost easier. You've got the audience there that's juicing you up. You've got this sort of now or never quality to the moment. You can be nervous, no question, but it's, being in a recording studio and recording a song and knowing that you can do it over and over again and getting sort of sick of the song and having people, in a booth watching you like you're a specimen under a microscope. These are not great conditions necessarily to produce like a spontaneous and wonderful performance. So there's something about being up against the live moment. But I love what you're saying about singing versus stand-up comedy, because you could not stumble over a single syllable there. You couldn't pause to search something out. And it made me realize as I was writing the book, thinking, stand-up comedy is way harder because I don't know, I wish I had sort of a metaphor at hand, but it's almost like stringing like single beads on a very fine string or something and having to do it with speed and elegance, and you can't fumble. Now, with singing, there's a momentum. It's funny. This is how I think of it because I used to sing. The band starts up. You're sort of riding their energy as well, and you hop on, and then you're going. But stand-up comedy, you're it. You're the whole band. You're the whole kit and caboodle. Yeah, that's terrifying. I don't know how you do it and did it. Incredible.
In chord theory, and that's how I learned to write. You have the tonic, and then you have the fifth. And normally we sing off that fifth, in the middle of it. And like if you're playing like "Take It Easy" by the Eagles, and you say "Lighten Up" to get that G in the key of G, right? You play the C chord, and that is the middle note in the three, C, G, and E. And it's interesting following through that and seeing people that would play against that, people that could sing, a second or a fifth inside of a regular chord, because your ear doesn't naturally hear it. It's a remarkable talent. But let me go back to the human voice in your travels, because you travel the world to try to get to the bottom of this. Is the human voice that unique in all of the species on the planet?
It is mostly because of how much control we have over it. The emotional part of our voice, the sort of actually kind of the singing part of it, the up and down melody and the kind of way we can drop into a growl or we can lighten it. Interestingly, animals do that. Non-human animals do that stuff. Your dog will growl to suggest hostility or threat, and it will raise its voice into a whine. Your cat has a wide range of different timbres and sounds that it makes. We actually have kind of made the spectrum of those sounds more refined. So we do a whole lot more sounds emotionally in that spectrum from growl to whine. But the other thing we do is we move our lips and tongue with this speed and precision and accuracy to create vowels and consonants that we pre-plan, so that I say the word did and not dad, or damn and not dac. So we're able to do that. It's interesting. I mean, dogs and cats actually also use their lips and tongue. A dog will howl, but it will also bark. A cat will meow. It's almost that 2-syllable sound. And it's doing that with its lips and its tongue, but we have refined it in this incredible way. So we think of language, and we're talking about the voice right now, and I seem to be talking about that thing that we call language, which we think of as like words printed on a page. That's not what language is. Language is air vibrations that we make with our lips and tongue that travel across space and beam my thoughts into your head through these super fast movements of my tongue, and the way I'm gauging the pressure of my diaphragm, releasing air, the speed at which I do it, when I choose to breathe, how hard I push it out, because I can go loud or I can go soft. And that's all controlled by my breathing too. So to answer your question, yeah, I mean, we actually use all the basic elements that non-human animals do, but we just have refined it into this incredible thing that gave us this unique power.
We're talking to John Colapinto. This is The Voice, is his remarkable book. All right, so, it's interesting. So we're talking on Zoom right now, but we don't have the camera on. And I'm a big believer, had we turned the cameras on and looked at each other, we would be talking a little bit different. We would be speaking a little bit differently. We would allow some of our facial expressions to carry the meaning that we usually use words for, or vocal intonations, right? And so it's on different, every different level that we go. I used to tell people that for a comedy club, it had to be the same as a movie. Everything that made a movie work would make this work. You have to have good lighting, you have to have good sound, you have to have everybody focused on a particular area, because it's all about the subtleties of that. I mean, if you were going to ask a woman to marry you, you wouldn't do it on a subway train, right? There's something about everything about it that makes those words even more important. One of the things I was interested in is your research said essentially that the subprimates, the chimpanzees, the orangutans, their communication system is not that sophisticated.
What I mostly found out, if I'm remembering it correctly, was that surprisingly, chimps and other simian, except not gibbons, which have this incredible singing voice, but their vocal expression is actually less subtle and varied than dogs and cats seemingly. They don't seem to make as many fascinating sounds. Now, that's not true of these squirrel monkeys that have been studied, that have like 50 different sort of discernible emotional messages that they're sending. But our chimp ancestors will say, you would expect, if evolution was this sort of simple march of species towards, complexity that we have, you would expect maybe that the chimp would have this voice that was very close to human. But instead, there's it's sort of surprisingly uninteresting a voice. That was what I was learning in my research and was a bit disappointed by, because I wanted to be able to say to my reader, and look, by the time we get to chimps, man, they're almost talking, but no such luck.
Well, what point in human evolution did language really surface?
Boy, they think it was about 400,000 years ago. Interestingly, it was kind of coincident with Neanderthals who we think of as kind of this dumb species, or we used to, but then we learned that their brain was slightly bigger than ours. And then there's now been this genetic testing of DNA from Neanderthal bones that shows they have the same 2 mutations on a particular gene for motor control that would have given them the same exquisite control over their vocal apparatus like us. the consonants and vowels and the ability to sequence them exactly right to make language. So we're talking, I think we were talking when we would have seemed pretty hairy and ape-like and kind of primitive, I guess. I mean, not actually hairy. We had already started to lose hair big time, but we would have seemed pretty sort of more on the sort of simian primate spectrum than we might think, and still be talking. That's what I can't get over.
And voice kind of just came out of a necessity to better organize, to be more efficient as a species, you think?
Incredible debate over this, of course. Noam Chomsky, the world's most famous linguist, would have told you no. He would have said, no, it has nothing to do with cooperation and communication. My goodness, no. Language just evolved for thought. First we were a smart species and we would think things through, and I don't understand why he said that. I tackle him, let's put it that way, in my book, because my God, starting with this weird creature, the lungfish, like millions of years ago, where there was sort of a proto-vocal cord, species have been making noises that are meaningful in terms of mating and threat, that really did become more sophisticated and refined as you move up the sort of species chain to mammals. So the short answer is yes. Language would have emerged from this need to communicate. Our species just lucked into a few sort of mutations that gave us this advantage, like a larynx that's permanently low in our throat, larynx being where our vocal cords are. And again, this couple of genetic mutations that gave us this control over our lips and tongue. And I'll just quickly, the reason that low larynx is of interest is because we make vowels, A, E, I, O, U, really by just reshaping the resonance chambers of our vocal tract, our throat and our mouth areas. And we do that with where we move our tongue. So if we had a very high larynx, like a chimp, this is partly why chimps have a boring voice. If it was right up sort of under our soft palate, we would really only have a mouth resonance chamber, and that limits the number of vowels you can make. And that limits language. I mean, it really reduces language to almost an impossibility. If you can make only like an sound, then I would be talking to you like that in terms of vowels.
Are there certain emotions that cross species? For example, if my dog were to hear my wife cry or scream, she would run, wanting to protect her because she would recognize that sound. Are there other emotions that that cross species that they would understand? Obviously, it's funny. I don't eat animals, right? And I don't eat them not necessarily for health, but I don't want, it's kind of a thing that I kind of picked up when I was a kid and then just stayed with it. And the communication between myself and dogs is probably more in my imagination than it is the actual communication. But there does seem to be, and pet owners will tell you right now listening, that there seems to be some kind of communication that when you talk, they can hear your voice. They obviously can recognize words. Why is it stunted? Did it not benefit certain species? They've been around forever.
Well, lots there that you said is just so interesting. First of all, I applaud not eating animals, which I don't do anymore either. Doing this book actually reinforced that because I was, obliged to read a lot of Darwin, who was exquisitely sensitive to the brilliance and emotionality of animals. The sort of scientific explanation for why animals, as you say, can pick up so much from our voice, and we pick up so much from theirs. We hear affection. We hear worry in dogs' whiny sounds and so on. I'm convinced of it. We can hear anxiety. We're getting a lot, and they're getting a tremendous amount from us. Science would tell you, whether it's right or not, that the reason they can't get themselves to talk is they don't do this particular mental operation we do called recursion, which in a nutshell just means putting one idea inside another. So we say the boat. Okay, that's one idea. But if you say the red boat, you're putting the idea of redness inside that phrase, the boat. All right. But in terms of actual words, we also use recursion. If you take the letters or the sounds, duh and g, and you put an O, you put the idea of an O between them, you get dog. But if you put the idea of an I, you get dig. Or if you put You get Doug. So we're literally think of a dog making its bark or a bird making its chirp. Those are individual sounds, not unlike a duh or a g. But what they don't do is string those together with the idea of one sound letter inside another to make a representation of dog. And so that's the incredibly complex thing that we're doing with our vocal sounds and also with this mental operation of creating words that represent things in the world. So we're pretty rare that way.
Yeah, REM is one of my favorite bands. They did a record once where they just did sounds. There were actually no words. And then they had the subtlety that was so amazing. The song, The One I Love, a great example. It's really a violent, horrible song about people using people, but so many people see it as a love song. So it's that combination of irony and insight that makes them just such great craftsmen of the human voice and the word combined together. Music's so complex. Is there anything we're leaving out when we're talking about the human voice and the expressions they make and how it affects people?
There is one sort of channel of the voice that doesn't get looked at much. It was looked at in the 50s. It was labeled and named and defined, and it's actually very interesting. It's the ums, the ers, the gasps, the trembles, the chuckles, the snorts. Every single sound that you can imagine that the vocal tract can make that isn't actually language or singing. But the weird thing is they communicate emotion too. They can be an index to a person's state of mind or heart. And a linguist back in the 1950s, a guy named Traeger, decided to document those. He worked for the State Department. And after the war, Americans, ambassadors were in every country. And there was like different parts of the State Department that had them learning like Japanese manners in terms of body motions and so on. Traeger's brief was to tell people how to use language. And he began, foreign languages. And he began to realize, wait, a cough or a snort or certain sounds are actually culturally, loaded. So he invented this incredible encyclopedia of noises that he scrupulously documented, but he didn't know what they meant. So he took them to psychiatrists. And one particular psychiatrist named Pittenger took him up on it. And they did this astonishing 5-minute analysis of a woman, her first therapy session. And they meticulously dissected the voice and these little noises she makes. And then they published it in a book, which really should be reprinted. Because it's amazing how in this very neutral seeming encounter, they use the sounds that she's making that are not language to show us how she eventually ends up, actually within 5 minutes, admitting that she wishes her husband would die. So she makes this incredible revelation that she's actually building up to, and that this psychiatrist is hearing through these noises, these extra linguistic noises. So that science was called paralanguage, and it's really died because this 5-minute analysis took like a team of psychiatrists like 2 years to do, just to parse 5 minutes. And I used to have a section in the book, which we ended up cutting because the book was getting too long, where I said, if you did that with Woody Allen, who's been in therapy for whatever it is, 50 years, like you'd fill up the entire New York Public Library stacks with books analyzing just like his first 2 years. So it's not a sort of practical science, but it's utterly fascinating.
Wow. I love and the affectations that people have. You remember Columbo? Just 1 second.
Yes, that's a great example.
It fascinates me to look at these great speakers and orators. And I think, why is it that low voice, we think we've evolved and we're so sophisticated, but they still hire the low voice guys to scare people, right? And I know these guys that do advertising, and I say, why are you so unimaginative? There are so many other cool voices out there.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's funny. It is sort of partly our evolutionary past. I mean, a deep voice is sort of a weaponized voice in a way because it's a size bluff. Yeah. So even like a little mouse, when it is threatened, it actually has a low voice register that it does to suggest that it's bigger than it actually is. Darwin looked at this in dogs. The reason they lower their voice to growl is it creates the illusion of longer, bigger vocal cords and thus a bigger body. And they actually match that by making their hair lift and their ears go up and they stand taller taller and stiffer. So all of it is a size bluff. My parakeet does it. I didn't know parakeets had this vocal range until I got this rather antisocial one. We've had a succession of them over the years. This is a female, actually, that it doesn't like getting on your finger, but if you extend a finger, it does this low, stuttering, like growl-like sound. So this seems to have been woven into the animal genome over millions of years, that a low voice is a dominant one because of this size bluff. And a higher one suggests even if a bear is making a high-pitched sound in affection, it's trying to pretend it's small like a baby. So these are all kind of size issues and size bluffs.
Well, did you look into stuttering at all?
I did a little bit, yes. And it's funny, it was almost a last minute thing to put it in because of Joe Biden. We suddenly thought it had some relevance. And that really is, they don't really know why it happens, but the suspicion now is that it's actually like a mess up in a part of the brain that's an ancient part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which is the part that kind of learns when you play piano, and it becomes automatic muscle memory, or when you ride a bike, just, you can never forget how, but you don't remember learning. That's really what we're doing with language. We're grooving these sounds into the basal ganglia as babies when we babble. But what happens is people with stuttering, they're starting to see that there's something maybe a little abnormal about their basal ganglia. It's not quite letting them sequence and groove in those movements as readily. There's also a psychological component. People that stutter will say, hey, I do it worse if I'm feeling anxious, of course.
Right.
Yeah. John Updike said he did it when he felt like he was sort of faking, when he felt like he didn't deserve a particular honor or something. He would stutter when he was meant to give a speech, this type of thing.
There's so many sounds that human beings make. There's the vulgar, like totally. But the one that fascinates me is that vocal growl. People that talk like that. I had a producer who was in her early 30s that used to do this. And she would do that thing like, and I would bring it to her attention, and she had no idea what I was talking about. And I have a brother-in-law who does it, and I want to strangle him every time he does it. I hope he never hears this. But what is that? What is that vocal growl?
Yeah, that's actually called the vocal fry. It's been named. And what it is, and the way it's achieved is you stiffen the vocal cords so that the air doesn't pass through them readily, and it kind of crackles and pops as it moves through the vocal cords. Ordinarily, we make an ah sound by making our vocal cords ripple very smoothly. Here you stiffen them. And, it's interesting. It became like such a phenomenon in young women in particular around 2010 that all of a sudden, like a spate of articles appeared in linguistics journals about it, like the vocal fry. And then there was all this like worrying about how it made women sound irritating and ineffectual and so on. The question became, where on earth did this come from? And I actually traced it to what's her name, Kim Kardashian, because that was literally the year that her television show, which had started in 2007, it peaked in popularity in 2010. And the vocal fry had been creeping up through those years, particularly in young women. And Kim speaks in a perpetual vocal fry. And my theory is that Kim does it in order to sort of bolster this impression she gives of being like a blasé, rich, pampered Beverly Hills woman that has no worries in the world. Now, why does the vocal fry communicate that? It's because if you're in the fry pitch range, you don't go up and down with your voice at all. In fact, the pitch stays totally constant. And pitch is how we express emotion. It's how we express love and fear and all those things, anxiety. Our voices are going up and down. They're going for a ride. Kim's doesn't. It's in like a blasé monotone. And it was a way for her, I think, subconsciously to sort of communicate, I don't have a worry in the world. Voices are contagious. Young women in those years, post-crash of Wall Street and you name it, whatever else, were anxious. They were emotional. They were worried. And my theory was they were trying to take the emotion out of their voice, to sound as calm and controlled as Kim. But I've come to believe it's something else after 2016 with the Trump's win and Brexit and all of these things that kind of angered a huge number of people, particularly women, not Brexit so much, but certainly Trump. And the Me Too movement Really what I think the fry is now doing, because it remains contagious. I mean, it is not abating at all. What it really is doing is it's communicating a bit of anger. It's actually a growl. It's literally how a dog growls or how a lion does. They tighten their vocal cords. It's the exact same set of laryngeal muscles. And if we have evolved our vocal expressions and emotions from our animal ancestors, I think it's almost indisputable that when women do that now, they are putting across a growl that is sort of saying, don't mess with me. And as I put it in the book, it's not the feminism of I am woman, hear me roar from the 70s, which is kind of theatrical and a little bit bluffing. Growls are the real thing. They're like, really don't mess with me. Like, I'm thoroughly annoyed. And I think the Me Too movement showed that there was some annoyance out there.
I don't know how many languages there are on earth, but I grew up kind of being babysat by a Salvadoran family, and I learned Spanish when I was like 5. She would only speak to me in Spanish, and today I don't speak any Spanish, but I still think occasionally in Spanish. I still think of the cold, and I think of frío, or I still think of goodbye as adios, but not the hard, Mexican adios, but the more of the soft Castilian adios. I don't know if any of that's accurate, but that's the way I think, and it's fascinated me to wonder, what if we embraced all these different languages and brought together the best words from each language? Would it change the way we think? I mean, at the very least, it would make us closer as a species, one would hope.
Yeah, no, all of that is totally fascinating. I think, although what's interesting is because I would agree readily that, if we kind of shared a common language, except there's one small problem. England. Think of it. They share a common tongue across the British Isles, yet the incredible number of accents in which they speak. And it really, in my research, showed me that you actually form accents. Accents form in order to create a sort of territorial marking against others who share your language but don't share your values. And a really great American linguist named Labov showed that that's how this vowel shift across the Great Lakes region started. So you've got literally people that are so distorting the vowels, like in the word Anne, the name Anne, they're saying like Ian, and I'm a real fan of, the beers. And so you've got this really weird vowel shift, but right up to their south, you've got people speaking in a southern drawl. And he traces this back, Labov, to when those people settled that area and they wanted to distinguish themselves from each other. And they literally pushed their voices apart. So not to be despairing, but I think even a common language might not do the trick, unfortunately, because we will start speaking it in slightly different ways, which are actually signals he showed for saying, I don't like you that much. Isn't that horrible? I mean, it was George Bernard Shaw who said in Pygmalion, an entire play about accents. He said in the preface, an Englishman cannot open his mouth without making another Englishman hate or despise him.
That's
and
funny.
He was really talking about that accent thing. Yeah, crazy.
Well, we could do a whole show on Floyd the Barber from Andy of Mayberry, who had that kind of little, and it was such a great voice, and whoever that actor was, and he came up with Floyd, and it's the whole thing with Southern men too, which is crazy as well too. This is fascinating stuff, and you have to write another book about this, right? It's got to be.
Well, you're making me realize that. I barely scratched the surface. These were just awesome questions, and I'm not just blowing smoke. That was awesome.
Well, check it out, everybody. The book is called This is the Voice. The author is John Colapinto. This is Mr. IQ.
You've been listening to the Mr. IQ podcast with Chip Franklin. To hear more, go to MrIQ.com or wherever you download your podcasts.